There are many places where we can learn about the writing of Jai Chakrabarti, and I have been reading about Jai, and when thinking about the title of this conversation, I was really moved by something he talked about in one of his interviews, which was about being trained as a vocalist in Indian classical music, and how he sort of talked about the music being woven into mood and the time of day and the ability for people to drop in and surrender to the improvisation. And it made me think about the value of conversation around our tone and our identity and our ability to rise up above noise and let people know who we are. And that's why we write, that's why we speak. And I feel very fortunate that we can start a conversation with Jai so that we can kind of talk about the power of identity through storytelling. But first I wanted to tell you a little bit about Jai, and then I'm going to link his website to you so that you can learn more about him. He's a incredible author, and celebrated, because his work reaches into our guts. He's not afraid to plumb the depths of family dynamic and history and all that good stuff. He was shortlisted for the PEN/Faulkner Award. He is described in the New York Times as an author of an exquisite collection of stories with his new book called A Small Sacrifice for Enormous Happiness. He has received placement in anthologies, in the O. Henry Prize Stories, the Best American Short Stories, and awarded a Pushcart Prize. And he also did performance in Symphony Space, which is one of my favorite places in New York to hear performances and music. But today we have the fortune to just see where this goes. And Jai, thank you for being here. And it seems like you move in a few different circles. You are a technologist, of course. You work as a senior director of engineering at Spotify, so you know voice, you love voice. And you also look at the power of voices through the ages. Your work definitely takes us on journeys. And I want to stop in the moment we're in talking about the power of voice to help us sort of push our identity out there in the world. So I wanted to ask you to start this conversation by talking about voice and voices of your characters, your voice, voices you hear on Spotify. Let's talk about voice and what it means to you and what it's meant to you in the past and how that's a changing identity for you as you live here in the times of broadcast and amplification. But the quieter moments where voices really kind of go down to a whisper and we really hear people's souls. So let's just start with your identity with voice. And thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Deborah. This is Jai. And thank you so much for the lovely question around the distinction of voice. And I love the phrasing around the distinction of voice, because distinction suggests a kind of difference or contrast. It suggests that each one of us within ourselves has a uniqueness, and that uniqueness can find its way into storytelling. And I think about storytelling not only narrowly in the sense of authors writing books or folks making films or any kind of professionalization of art, but rather in the sense that we all have stories to tell. And so we each have a voice that is our own, that is unique, that is the sum of all of our experiences and everything that we have ingested that makes us who we are. And so sometimes as writers, we are thinking about cultivating our own voice finding what is unique about us. And I think that's one of the most interesting, charged, juicy things that a writer can undergo, because it is also a process by which we are plumbing ourselves to understand who we are in this world and to understand what it is about the sum of experiences that we have lived through, what it is about those experiences that makes us uniquely us. And so I think storytelling is a wonderful medium where this can be explored. And it's also a medium where it's important for us to recognize and celebrate marginalized voices, both as readers or as listeners. And I think that's an area in particular where we all have a role to uplift the voices that we may not hear so frequently, the voices that may not have the same privilege as we do to be able to put words on a page or in another medium. And so I think we both have this wonderful opportunity, each of us as humans, really, to find our stories in the world. And at the same time, I think we also have a beautiful responsibility to uplift the voices of others, especially those who may not have the same kinds of privilege, the same voice to speak. So thank you for engaging me in this conversation.
I love your answer, and the idea of being the sum of all our experiences is so true. And it makes me think about how we step into different situations and, find our voice in those situations. And sometimes it's very different. And as people who are in conversation, especially here, different topics bring out different parts of those experiences that we lived in. And then sometimes our voices actually show us that we're complicated. Something that I'm finding very interesting about celebrating cognitive dissonance is that sometimes two things can be true at the same time. And that sometimes is something that you can really trip over because you have different feelings about different things, and you might find yourself speaking from a different place. And I love that depth of a person, and I'm sure as a writer you play with that a lot. But when we think about this idea of finding power in our story, and people listening to this and thinking about, what is my voice? I'm wondering, at what point in your career did you realize that literally writing stories, was the way your voice was going to find its power? Because through your characters, we get to find out who you are, but truly, it must have been a calling at some point. And I'm asking you to tell us this because I think a lot of people are always curious about that turning point in one's career where they're saying, oh, wow, I think I have not only something to say, but I have something to say through other characters. So it's not just an autobiographical pull for life journaling, but you created characters in your books. So when was that time that you knew that was the way you were going to amplify your identity through your voice?
Hi, Deborah, and thank you for that lovely question and this continuing conversation. I also appreciate the language around how two things can be true at the same time. Sometimes things in opposition can be true at the same time. And I will say that that's a governing principle for my writing, that things in opposition somehow can still magically come together and make for a beautiful story. And it's the sort of the tension between the poles that I find to be really interesting to explore as a writer. And getting to your question of how did I know, or when did I know that I was a writer, and how did I come to find my voice around that? For me, it was really in the transition moment from when I left India and came to the United States for the first time. And I was a child of about 9 years old, and I didn't speak English well, but I realized that I could step back and I could start to write stories, that I could synthesize the world around me. And instead of retelling exactly what was happening, I could use my imagination to find another world or many different worlds to live in. And that was really kind of for me the moment that opened up the world of writing to me. And when I think about finding your voice, I think about it as a long journey, as something, as an evolution. I think I'm still finding my voice as a writer. I think that as I read more, as I live more, I find there are aspects of my truth that I'm willing to access that I wasn't before when I was younger, when I hadn't lived in the way I've lived. And so I think that's also part of the joy of being a writer, is that you're also kind of getting to find new parts of your voice, new ways in which you can connect with your voice. So thank you for the lovely question, and I hope to learn from others on how they think of finding their voice and when they became a writer in this world.
Hey, Jai, thank you so much for connecting us to your inner world and how things emerged. I'm going to tag Catherine Coles because she's a resident writer here on Swell, a poet, a speaker, and she's always prompting us to kind of delve into the why of certain aspects of our both creating poetry and also, how words, evoke certain aspects of our inner selves and our connection to the outer world. And I wanted to open up this conversation to who's ever listening, but since you are, I hope, listening, maybe you perhaps can speak to the title that I gave this, which is about distinction of our voices and this idea that, our commonalities bond us. So we have this universality to our stories, but when we do speak, there's an emergence of singularity. We are all so unique. And I think that as a writer, you must look at your characters as representational, as well as having their own unique role in the magical world you create. But how much are you called to use your art, your voice, your writing to inspire people to feel more deeply human? Because contextually, I think as writers, we sometimes, or as artists, we become activists, and sometimes we wake up and sometimes we have a calling to stir people. Do you have that calling, and do you do that through your work? And do you hope that that's what's happening when people read your work? And I speak to this to you not only as a writer, but as somebody who lives in a space where there's sound around you. You're a technologist, you're in the sound space. Like, I think finding our individual voices is so critical, but also connecting us together is equally as important. So it's that bridge that we build as artists. How does that resonate with you in terms of your raison d'etre as a writer?
Hey, hello, Deborah and Jai. Paju here. Deborah, thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. It is quite timely, and I'm not sure if you had been hearing some of my swells and thinking very specifically about it, or if it's just random. Either way, a wonderful treat for me. Yes, how do we find our voice? What is our voice? What is our voice used for? How do we engage in the world to create a resonance, to have a voice, to speak of specific things? I.e., what are we willing to give up for an idea, and what are we willing to have taken from us for an idea or an understanding? Certainly where I've been living with my exploration into what I'm calling the unheld, the world of the homeless, of the drug addict, the ex-felon, the people in most need, as far as I see it. And to have been so involved with an individual and a culture, language and symbol was everything that I was trying to learn, everything that I was seeing happening and playing out. How do we find our voices? How do we find our personality? So much of our life is, and our identification is veneers that are placed on us by those around us. And so, as we go through life's journey and the act of walking our path, as I think one inevitably is doing, whether they're aware of it or not, that is, their own sort of samsara to deal with. But to have an investigative life, I think it is the idea of taking off these veneers to get to the true self. And I find that my storytelling is a combination of universality and absolute autobiography. I speak about events that happen in my life because I understand them in mythic terms. Given, and admittedly, the things that have happened in my life have been extremely bizarre. And so I personally feel I have no choice but to tell the story. So I feel as though this is something that I've been put into. This is what I've been given to do. And it's taken many shapes. The language of movement was how I started. But we go through our life and we tell our story, and it's different elements of our ego are being engaged with the idea, I believe. And in telling the story, we are freeing ourselves of the burden of holding on to this particular channel of our identity. This particular layer of veneer can be released. Because it is a story, you've told it, you no longer have to have anything to do with it. It becomes its own myth. And you go on and on and you tell these stories, and you can think of it as peeling away layers of your ego, because whatever you're writing, whether it's absolute fantasy or a biography, you're telling a story. You're using symbols and embellishments and color schemes and things that you notice to tell it. And that's just a part of what you're seeing and who you are. And once you say it, you can release it and go on. And so more and more, I'm finding that I'm stripping away the self that I'm identifying with and that people identify with me. And I'm finding a deeper voice, more resonant voice, that is speaking of much more... I'm speaking of things in a different way because I am holding things in a more lofty place in my own being. I am letting myself be as the firmament rising to the top of whatever, the water, the fluid, the foam. But I think that telling stories is akin to the idea of disengagement, and we are accumulated karma as we go on, and this is how we go, and we want to release those things from us. And telling our stories is, to me, like releasing my karma, and it's releasing my things, and I'm telling them, and I'm giving the way, and I'm holding myself accountable, and hoping that others can find beauty and purpose in them. Thank you so much. Peace.
This conversation's very close to my heart since I'm a poet, and Jai, I especially admired the way in which you acknowledge that voices are the sum total of all of our experiences coming together in our speech, in our vocalization, in our writing, and what that means to me. And what I try to tell my students who will talk about finding their voice as if they'll be walking down the sidewalk some morning and there it will be, and then they will have it, and it will stay the same for the rest of our lives, is that our voices are evolving all the time. And every time we change, every time we learn something, our voices, in my opinion, are also constantly changing and adapting to our new circumstances or to what we're learning. As a poet, like a songwriter, and Deborah, you know more about this than I do, so maybe I'm making assumptions, but I often work out loud. My husband can tell that I'm working on a poem because I'm walking around the house muttering to myself and speaking the words, trying to find my way into them and into their exact formulation. So trying to find my way into voice, which once again is constantly being built, not just sitting there waiting for me. And then just as one final addendum, many of my favorite poets are also great readers of their own poems. And the more that's the case, the more I reach a point with them after I've heard them read, sometimes after I've heard them read only once their own poems in my presence, but certainly if I've heard them read a number of times, I can't encounter a poem of theirs on the page without actually hearing their voices in my ears. And what I imagine is that those locations in my brain that process sound are actually lighting up as if I'm actually hearing their voices in my ears. So one of my goals for myself is to be one of those poets for whom the speaking voice becomes a really inherent part of the poem.